Does this look to you like a homestead from the early days of prairie settlement? If not, you're not alone. Saskatchewan's history is filled with pioneer stories of backbreaking work on the homestead. Sod houses, sacrifice, deprivation, isolation, all far from the comfort of homes they'd left behind. But this woman, in her frilly dress, lounging in her garden while her baby plays nearby, is actually one of Saskatchewan's earliest settlers from right next door to Kenosee Lake. Her story, and that of many others like her in her long-since-vanished town, is a much romanticized piece of prairie history, but it's also a story of how Kenosee Lake came to be. Cannington Manor Provincial Historic Park, a short distance east of Kenosee Lake, commemorates the unique history of the town. Costumed park interpreters are on site throughout the summer to bring Cannington Manor to life, answering questions, guiding tours, and leading demonstrations, so visitors can become acquainted with daily life in the historic village. When massive waves of immigrants colonized the Prairie West around 1900, the character of Saskatchewan was distinctly working class. Hardworking people of modest means who came to build better lives for themselves. But things were a little different at Cannington Manor. Survey parties arrived in the Moose Mountain district as early as 1879, noting that the area was ideal for agriculture due to the excellent quality of soils as well as the wood, water, and hunting opportunities of the Moose Mountain forest nearby. Early settlers from Ontario arrived around 1880 to establish the first homesteads east of the forest. Edward Mitchell Pierce, an upper-middle-class English gentleman of means who had lost much of his wealth in a bank failure, moved to the district in 1882, where he built a home for his family on a homestead. He established an agricultural school, or pup farm as it was called, where upper-middle-class Englishmen could be trained to become gentlemen farmers for £100 a year. This eventually drew many men of relative means to the town, changing the character it would develop in years to come. Pierce gained permission to establish a colony next to his property, promising it would seed the area with British civilizing influence. Cannington Manor, as he named it, was established in a flurry of construction in the summers of 1884 and 1885. The privileged of England's gentry came to Cannington Manor, determined to recapture the slowly declining, romanticized world of leisured country living enjoyed by gentlemen farmers of halcyon days. Generally, this meant they would live in grand homes, pay laborers to do all work for them, and indulge in a life of whimsical leisure at the pinnacle of a social hierarchy of their design, where they took the top spot. Having money to spend on expensive photographs, along with a local elite who had himself taken hobby photography to a professional level, Cannington Manor's upper crust immodestly documented themselves partaking in a wide variety of genteel activities, often with a romanticized British colonial color. Because the visual historical record documented these activities in abundance and the lives of their laboring social inferiors so rarely, the popular imagination has created a false impression of the time, leading many to mistakenly assume that everyone at Cannington Manor enjoyed this same leisured life, when the reality was most definitely quite different. Eventually, tennis parties, rugby teams, cricket games, horse races, picnics, boating excursions, card games, amateur musicals and theater, and even fox hunting parties with hounds imported from the Isle of Wight all became common parts of life at Cannington, and over time it became assumed that this was what village life was like for everyone. However, Cannington Manor wasn't just characterized by class differences and social hierarchies. Class differences played a crucial part of the local economy for settlers to the region who relied on their own labor for their livelihoods. Ernest Becton provides an ideal example of how a socially stratified frontier economy functioned. Becton and his brothers built no ordinary log shack or sod house, but a large 26-room stone mansion that even included a spacious ballroom for entertaining. The house was fully staffed in English manorial style, including Ernest's own private valet. A staff of 8 men was employed full-time, charged only with heating the home, harvesting and supplying the mansion with timber from the forest nearby. Even more impressive was the stable. Constructed of the same stones as the house, it ran 120 feet long by 24 feet wide. It housed Becton's thoroughbred racehorses who became famous all around North America, and had been appointed as lavishly as the house with polished mahogany stalls for the horses, who each had an engraved brass nameplate mounted above their heads. Ernest Becton was an industry in himself. easily employing in excess of 50 laborers at any given time, including horse trainers and jockeys, and even a foreman who ran Becton's operation, so the man himself could enjoy the life of leisure his wealth had provided. Local settlers often depended on the additional income they earned at the Didsbury Ranch, and at Becton's instruction, special arrangements were always made for workers so they could tend to their own homesteads nearby. So, class difference at Cannington Manor was about more than some people having more money than others or a higher social position. It extended to an economic system that, while separating rich and poor, may have also provided financial advantages to the settlers whose success in the district depended entirely on the fruits of their labors. In this way, social stratification didn't merely separate the wealthy from the working, but separated employers from those who worked for them. Compounding this, we might simply ask, while the wealthy of Cannington played at afternoon games, where were the less privileged of the village? Most likely, they were working. A short distance through the forest to the west lay Kenosee Lake, called Fish Lake throughout this early era. Regardless of class or social position, the people of Cannington Manor all grew to love the natural landscape of the lake and came to cultivate it as a resort from their earliest days visiting there. Some even came to call it home. People first came to the Moose Mountain Forest from Cannington out of necessity. Pictured here around 1888, workers from the district set up shared log cabins they could use as required in order to supply nearby settlers with resources the forest had to offer. Most often, this meant timber used for fuel and sometimes construction. In winter or summer, in rain or shine, men from the district worked in the forest harvesting wood for fuel to keep stovetops cooking and homes in the district warm all winter. Most men would have at least resorted to the forest to collect wood for themselves, but many were also commissioned by others who wished to pay for this service. Ernest Becton, for instance, continually had foremen employed full-time, year-round, felling timbers in the forest that fueled the Didsbury Ranch community alone. Moving further and further into the forest over the years, local men became intimately acquainted with the geography of the forest that led to the shores of a pristine Kenosee Lake. Fred Christopher was one of these men. A man of modest means, Christopher had homesteaded near the forest west of Cannington Manor around 1890 and, along with his sons, harvested timber all year round for sale in the village. This is Captain David Powell, known as Skipper at Cannington. He's reported in some accounts to be Kenosee Lake's first permanent resident. The captain built his log cabin near the present-day site of the Moosehead Inn, where he lived from 1894 until his death almost 20 years later. However, some sources say this was the first log cabin built at Kenosee Lake, constructed by Harold Fripp in 1895. Harold had homesteaded a modest farm in the district alongside his brother Percy many years earlier. Part of Cannington's privileged class, he and his brother established the Cannington Flour Mill, where he worked as a miller and won the prize for best flour at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. This cabin's location remains unclear, but records suggest it was built at the lake at least around the same time as Captain Powell's. By 1895, Harold had also built this home for his brother Percy, a short distance away from the cabin he'd built for himself the year before. Fred Christopher, who had harvested wood from the forest since the early 1890s, happened upon the lake shortly after his arrival. Having grown up in Ontario, Christopher had a well-developed taste for the fish of Lake Erie and often made trips to the lake to gather fish for himself and his family. His descendants would later remember that it was love at first sight when Christopher saw the lake. From that very first day, he spoke thereafter of setting up a resort. It was around this time that Fred had learned the native word for fish and telling it to his children when they began to call Fish Lake by their own nickname, Kenosee, little knowing it would be officially named that in the decades to come. In 1894, desiring a more direct route to the lake for himself and the residents of Cannington Manor, Christopher organized numerous neighbors who worked very hard to clear a direct trail to Kenosee, which later became known as the popular Christopher Trail. The tedious journey to the shores of Kenosee had become a much shorter and more scenic route thanks to Christopher's experience harvesting timber in the forest. The following year, Christopher had built his family a small log cabin with a sod roof on the beach in front of where Kenosee Gardens now sits. Many visitors came to Kenosee in the summer of 1895 asking to rent the Christopher's rowboats for the day. The following year, they served meals to guests and had large recreational rowboats for rent from their lakeside home. In the summer of 1897, they opened the Saints Rest Resort, where tents could be rented for overnight stays, boats could be rented in the daytime, and meals were served from the Christopher's own table. This was the very first place to stay at the lake. In 1899, when Percy Fripp decided to sell his property and retire back to his home in England, Fred Christopher seized the opportunity to buy his land and charming log cabin. He added onto the home, opening it that summer as a small upscale hotel, the first hotel at Kenosee. His resort was now complete. With a hotel, dining room, tents for rent, communal spaces for campfires and dancing, a mobile ice cream stand and confectionery, and of course, many boats available for visitors. The resort prospered and expanded, even with a small schooner called the Britannica being added to the Christophers' fleet of boats. Settlement had accelerated greatly in the nearly 10 years since the Christophers had arrived. Where previously there had only been Cannington Manor, by 1900 there were many towns surrounding the Moose Mountain Forest, with all kinds of visitors arriving at Kenosee in increasing numbers. Kenosee Lake was established, and Fred Christopher's dreamt-of resort had become a phenomenal success that would grow and expand far beyond anything he'd even imagined. Though Kenosee Lake had been born from the unique culture of Cannington Manor, as the lake grew and prospered by 1900, the village of Cannington had been withering away to nothing. Multiple factors had conspired against the success of the colony, but when the promised railroad failed to come to Cannington, it was inevitable that businesses and people would relocate to the new railway towns nearby. At the same time, Cannington's upper crust all, one by one, packed their things and returned to their homes in England, never to be heard from again. Businesses like Cannington's Moose Mountain Trading Company abandoned their original spots in the village as business dwindled and moved to a new town to the south located on the railway line. It was called Manor, named after Cannington Manor, and it was the default location for the former village's businesses and people to relocate to. Here on Manor's main street, the Moose Mountain Trading Company reopened its doors, and by 1900, Cannington Manor lay abandoned. This is the last known photo of Cannington Manor. Taken in 1915, it shows the abandoned town site that had been so full of life 20 years before. Shortly after this photo was taken, demolition work began that would see all the buildings except for the church torn down within a couple of years. Former residents of Cannington Manor, who called themselves the Old Timers, held reunions in the years that followed, remembering and romanticizing the village where they had lived many years before, trying to preserve the friendships and social ties that had made their village so cherished amongst them. Although Cannington Manor had passed into memory, like the old-timers themselves who carried on a short distance away, Cannington's most beautiful dream, at Kenosee, lived on.